The history of these two men is intertwined. But going straight from Eugene Debs to Bernie Sanders isn't simple or intellectually honest. Imagine the America of the 1880s when Debs first ran for the Indiana State Assembly as a Democrat. He wasn't opposed to capitalism at the time. This was a time of new factories and growing railroads, of long hours and little pay, of immigrants and children working away to survive in urban environments. In 1893, Debs helped to create the American Railway Union, and it wasn't long before he was dragged into one of the most consequential strikes in American history. Because, also in 1893, the Pullman Palace Car Company, citing economic woes, cut wages for all workers by 28%. The ARU members demanded a strike, but Debs was skeptical. The union didn't listen. They began a strike of the railway, refusing to service any rail cars, including the U.S. mail. President Cleveland sent the U.S. Army to end the strike, as it interfered with the mail. The ensuing chaos would lead to deaths of strikers and almost $100 million in property damage. Eugene found himself in violation of a federal government injunction to end the strike, and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. Before this moment, Eugene simply saw himself as an American, perhaps even as a Democrat. Like many Americans, he probably didn't see class. However, he was now witness to the federal suppression of labor. Convinced that both parties were set against the worker, he now believed it was time for Americans to reject their labels as Democrats and Republicans and to re-identify as a working class. During his prison time, he was flooded with socialist and communist writings. He was even visited by a prominent socialist newspaper editor named Victor Berger, who would later go on to be the first socialist member of Congress. All of this had a convincing influence for Debs. He emerged from prison as a socialist. We might call him today a democratic socialist, a balancer of constitutional rights and popular sovereignty, but also one that seeks to publicly manage and distribute the economic activity of the nation, an attempt to find social justice through government, not by eliminating it. Debs left the Democratic Party and not long after was running as the Social Democratic Party's nominee for president. Debs was not only a religious man, he was an evangelical for the cause of socialism. According to many, he was an impassioned and entertaining public speaker. He ran 5 times as the nominee of various versions of the Socialist Party for president. His high water mark, and arguably the high water mark of the socialist movement in America, was the election of 1912, where he garnered 5.99% of the vote. It's been downhill ever since for Debs' movement. 2 World War, 2 Red Scares, and a Cold War made sure of it. That was until 2015, when Senator Bernie Sanders entered the Democratic primary race, igniting the hopes of liberals and democratic socialists all over the United States.
And that is why what this campaign is about is saying loudly and clearly, it is not just about electing Bernie Sanders for president, it is about creating a grassroots political movement in this country.
You sell a product. In politics, you sell yourself, which is why Bernie Sanders is a good politician. It's all he does. He's been running for office since 1972, affording him the luxury of selling a failed ideology that never requires purchase. Socialism, a harmless thing until it finds real power, then it's deadly. Then it's deadly.
Today, socialist is a dirty word in our media and in our discourse. The results of decades of witch hunts and a freezing battle with the Soviet Union that left the reputation of Eugene Debs, what little was left, forever scarred. Rather than the charismatic religious man that he was, they called him traitor. During the First World War, Debs was unjustly imprisoned by the Wilson administration. Under a new law, the Espionage Act of 1917, Debs was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The crime? Speaking out against the war, and according to the government, advocating draft dodging. Having read the speech in question personally, which Debs gave in Canton, Ohio, I can tell you. First, Debs knew that the feds were simply waiting to arrest him. He said, "I must be exceedingly careful, prudent, as to what I say, and even more careful and prudent as to how I say it." Debs went on a tirade against what he perceived as a war by and for the capitalists of industry and government. He did take time to praise other protesters of the war, including some who had been arrested for resisting the draft. Thus, where the government got their justification for conviction, Debs' main objective was speaking out against the war, challenging large government decisions should never carry imprisonment. I've left a link to the speech in question below so you can decide for yourself. His defense called no witness, merely asking that Debs be allowed to speak before the court, during which he gave this impassioned realization. Your Honor, I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Debs' sentence was commuted by President Warren Harding in 1921. He left prison to cheers from fellow inmates. Despite their shun from the public discourse in the following decades, it should be noted that socialists did in fact have an influence. From Roosevelt's New Deal to LBJ's Great Society, new worker unions and more populist policies were common in the mid-20th century. The inception of these new groups and laws could easily be tracked back to contenders like Eugene Debs. Which leads us to this man. Bernie Sanders is currently facing the same stigmatization. Rather than debate his ideas, he is being dismissed as an extremist. But pundits are ignoring something totally different. Some Americans are seemingly ready to rethink long-shunned labels. The large crowds of enthusiastic Bernie Sanders supporters will make this fact increasingly hard to ignore. Further, there is one huge difference between Debs and Sanders. Debs always ran for president as a socialist, but never really wanted to be the president. He always maintained that should the movement ever grow big enough to win, he wouldn't like to be at the helm. On the other hand, Bernie Sanders is not looking to lose. Perhaps looking to Debs' legacy, Sanders is running as a Democrat rather than as an independent. He wants to coalesce with a major party to increase his chances of winning. He is focused on ideas, but isn't an idealist. For this reason, it would be unwise to call Bernie Sanders the second coming of Eugene Debs. That said, they are forever linked in the history of the United States.
Today, with your support and the support of millions of people throughout our country, we begin a political revolution to transform our country economically, politically, socially, and environmentally.